Welcome to the spotlight presentation of the importance of crop wild relatives of oats, Avena, for the class Crop Wild Relatives and Professor Dr. Rivard by Elaine Tiener, November 13, 2023. And I wanted to draw your attention to the image of the girl at the left. She's wearing a beautiful headdress made out of many different crops. She's from Ukraine. And I thought this was a great image to introduce oats because Ukraine is one of the countries in which the crop wild relative species originated. And it's also culturally important to the people there. The first slide is the biology of oats, Avena. Classification is the family of Gramineae, the tribe Avenae, genus Avena. This grass family includes wheat, rice, barley, common millet, maize, sorghum, and sugarcane. Barley, rye, and oats are considered secondary cereal crops. Wild and cultivated species have 3 karyological groups with 14, 28, and 42 chromosomes. Using Baum's numerical taxonomy system, genus Avena comprises 30 species, including 16 diploids, 8 tetraploids, and 6 hexaploids. Oat species are an annual grass, monocotyledonous flowering plants with floral biology of small seeds that are self-pollinating. Avena M is the one exception, being a perennial that utilizes cross-pollination. And on the right, you can see a ripe oat plant that is now turned brown. It's ready for harvest. And there's a drawing of the plant itself, where you have the stem and the leaves, the main stem, branches, whorl of branches, and an oat spikelet. And inside the spikelet is your groat kernel. Phenology of oat taxa. Seasonal flowering behavior is controlled by vernalization, in which the plant seed needs a longer cold period to germinate. Oat is daylight long responsive, and spring is a good time to plant in the northern hemisphere. Breeding cultivars takes advantage of this to attune planting times to region and farming methods. Oats are grown mainly in Eastern and Northwestern Europe, Canada, North America, Russia, Australia, Mongolia, and China. Cultivated oat species are hexaploid temperate cereals. And there is a nice phenological map on the bottom, and it's showing the crop wild relative species coming out of the Middle Eastern Fertile Crescent and expanding, and they have an evolutionary pathway of the species and forms, and then there's a probable evolutionary pathway of the hexaploid cultivated species, which is what we use to breed, which is mainly A. sterilis and A. sativa, and it's in the left-hand top with the greenish blue color. Historic native range of Avena. Historically, oats came from the Middle East Fertile Crescent and spread throughout Europe into cooler regions with moist, temperate climates. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers potentially used crop wild relatives as food. Oats existed in wheat and barley crops as a weed during the Neolithic period. About 2,000 years ago, humans began growing it as a crop due to ability to produce well on marginal lands and poor soils. Oats came later in agricultural development than other crops like wheat, rye, barley, and emmer. Cultivation as a cereal grain crop and fodder crop in Central Europe happened outside the origin range. Possibly domesticated twice as crop wild relatives in central Turkey, are most closely related to cultivated Avena sativa, white oat, while Mediterranean oats are most related to Avena byzantine, red oat, crop wild relatives in southwestern Turkey. The greatest number of biological species occurs in North Africa, southern Spain, and Sicily. Tetraploid species, which form the secondary gene pool, are mostly restricted in distribution and rare in nature and in collections. They occur in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Spain, and Sicily. Centers of diversity for the cultivated forms have been identified in Spain and Portugal, Great Britain, Ethiopia, Algeria and Morocco, Iran, Georgia and Tatarstan, Mongolia, and China. So this is the map of historic range for Avena crop wild relatives. And it comes from one of my reference sources, and it's labeled Evolution Pathways of Cultivated Avena Species. And as you can see, there's a circle where Turkey and Syria are, and it's the Fertile Crescent Mediterranean region where the evolution points to its origin. And then it will go north into Russia and Eastern Europe. Another pathway goes through Egypt and over to Morocco, and then up through Western Europe, all the way up into the UK and Scotland, and really way up into Finland. And then there's a southerly route that goes down into Ethiopia and doesn't go farther because it's really too arid for it to exist. So it's kind of stuck in the southern region right there. And then there's another line that goes to the east, Mongolia, China. And from then on, it will go to Australia eventually, and New Zealand, as well as coming from Europe, it's going to go to North America and even into South America. And I put a quote at the bottom from one of the references. Approximately 10% of the Earth's vascular plants, 25,000, exist in the Mediterranean basin on less than 2% of the area of land on Earth, and 50% of these species exist nowhere else on the planet. I thought that was pretty incredible. Description of characters of Avena, characteristics. The cultivated species have larger growths or kernels than the crop wild relative species. They have longer and thicker growths and are able to disengage the hull easier in harvest. And the hull is a protective layer surrounding the groat. You can see in the diagram to the left in black and white. The groat is made up of layers. The outermost is the bran containing dietary fibers, protein, and phenolics. Then the germ is the protein inside, and the endosperm is the starch. And on the right is another diagram that is actually from the southern hemisphere, when to plant in autumn when it's cooler and it's more moist. But I love this diagram because it shows you the vernalization. It needs a cold period, and it shows the growth where there's some tillering after the germination. Stem elongation happens, and then the reproductive stage is when the daylight lengthens, and you've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. Panicle length, the floret number, that's how many florets are like the flower part inside where the panicle is. And then you can see that there's a ripening stage when it's the hottest, and the maturation where you can harvest your grain. Conservation status of Avena. On-farm conservation is a term used in Europe for in situ conservation. Avena species ex situ and in situ need regional and national programs to help grow collections and preserve rare and high priority crop wild relatives. From survey work for Global Crop Diversity Trusts in 2008, the largest ex situ collections with global coverage are Canada, the USDA, Vavilov Institute, IPK Germany, Australian Winter Cereals Collection, and National Gene Bank of Kenya. Some smaller collections that are important for specific species or national regional focus are A. sterilis in the Israeli Lieberman Germplasm Collection. INRA Morocco has endemic and rare species. In China, for the naked oat land races, A. sativa, subspecies Nuda sativa. Study for Global Crop Diversity Trust in 2008. Respondents of the survey questionnaire cited ex situ conservation gaps in insufficient population sample representation per species and insufficient ecological representation of the species. Additional gaps, for example, are the lack of available origin data. Zare et al. 2021 found ex situ conservation gaps in 441 priority crop wild relatives in the Fertile Crescent region using occurrence data. 134, 30% of the crop wild relatives are not in any gene bank collections. Of 307, 70% of the crop wild relatives represented, 57% have less than 10 accessions. Phillips et al. In 2019 found that 10 protected locations for an in situ conservation would protect 80% of the taxa and for the Fertile Crescent area. Raggi et al. 2022 found national rural development programs, that's NRDP in Italy, have guaranteed economic support for land races in situ and favored the implementation of regional laws providing funds for land race, ex situ, and in situ conservation. Nordic crop wild relative checklist was formed of 2,553 taxa related to crop plants that have socioeconomic and utilization importance. Out of these, 114 taxa, including 83 species, were prioritized, representing vegetable, cereal, fruit, berry, nut, and forage crop groups. The Nordic checklist includes countries Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Global Crop Diversity Trust in 2008 study reports that for ex situ long-term storage, most samples are in deep freeze of below 10 to below 20 degrees Celsius. Some facilities keep control of low humidity at 5 to 15% levels. Morocco and Spain have problems with in situ collections needing regeneration. And a study by Loskutov in 2008 reported global ex situ collection had 10,000 accessions of cultivated and 2,000 accessions of wild Avena, their diversity being both specific and intraspecific. So following, we have a table showing ex situ gene bank collections of rare in situ Avena crop wild relatives. And mainly they're in the area from Morocco, across the north of Africa and to Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia. And we have Spain. And it's showing species that are endemic and locally rare, and on the left, endemic and locally common, and restricted ecologically and locally common. And you've got the species next in line, and then you've got the countries they're associated with, and the 6 gene banks that were in this study. The first one is Canada, the second one is Great Britain, third is Russia, the fourth is Morocco, then Germany and the US. And you can see Germany and the US have some holes that do not have some of the endemic and locally rare collections. And you can see that Canada, the PGRC gene bank, pretty much has all of them, which is great. They have one of the largest collections in the world. But it would be nice to see the US also sharing the collection. And you can see also that there are a few species that are well under 10 accessions, and some only have 1 accession, or 2 or 4. So it's interesting. I wish that I had a chart from 2022 or 2023 to see if any of those numbers and other gene banks maybe have been added that collect the in situ plants. But I thought that was interesting to show. So what are some advantages of using Avena crop wild relative species? Avena crop wild relatives grow in a variety of climates so that cold hardiness, heat tolerance, and some disease resistance can be found within certain species. Avena grows well on marginal land and in poor soil, clay, and is highly competitive with other crops. Compared with that of other cereals, oat cultivation requires fewer treatments with insecticides, fungicides, or fertilizers. Many ex situ collection banks contain species with representation from most crop wild relatives. Oats can be eaten by gluten-sensitive people because globular proteins like rice are stored in the grain instead of gluten proteins like wheat, barley, and rye. Sustainable agricultural use, as oats reduce disease within cereal crop rotations. Oat is currently the 7th most economically important cereal. Maize, wheat, rice, barley, sorghum, and millet rank 1 to 6th place. However, oat may perhaps eclipse some in the future. Difficulties of using Avena crop wild relative species. Genetic research is slow. Scientific effort is behind of other cereal crops due to neglect of oat as human food source. Current research interest focuses on developing oat more broadly for food source, using crop wild relative species traits that have advantages to pests, diseases, climate change, and nutrition content in cultivar breeding programs. Complicated genetic layout that still needs research, as currently lack fully annotated reference genome. In contrast to wheat, interploidy crosses and alien introgressions have been extremely challenging in Avena, suggesting that incompatible genome architecture is an additional barrier preventing genetic gains in oat. Using secondary phenotypes is more difficult because of sterility issues in offspring. Traits can show resistance to diseases, but eventually, around 5 years, the cultivar's ability decreases over time. Some Avena crop wild relatives are difficult weed species. Harker et al. In 2016 did a Canadian study that shows field trials using integrated weed management where perennial alfalfa was used as a cover crop over 3 years, functioned successfully to reduce wild oat populations, Avena fatua, biomass, and seed density without herbicide use. A fatua is considered an agricultural pest. Prospective uses of Avena crop wild relatives. The primary aim of breeding programs is to develop cultivars with improved agronomic performance, including high grain yield and grain quality, disease and lodging resistance, as well as adaptability to changing environmental conditions. Present diseases are crown rust, stem rust, and powdery mildew. A. sterilis has been used in breeding programs for crown rust resistance, especially used in South American breeding programs. However, in the U.S., this species is a weed and breeding requires special permission. A. fatua has resistance traits to crown rust, stem rust, smuts, cold temperature, is drought tolerant, and has high contents of protein and oil. A research study by Kamal et al. In 2022, for the first time, fully annotated a hexaploid oat reference genome of cultivar A. sativa named Sang. It found that the manipulation of a mutant gene of A. sativa affects epicuticular characteristic, the outer fiber of the oat plant with wax composition, producing a cultivar glossy 0.1, which is an advantage in breeding for hotter climates. Landrace species grown in small fields in Nordic countries of England, Scotland, and Ukraine have cultural importance, mainly grown by older farmers for local use. An example is the Scottish oatcakes as a traditional food in Scotland since the Roman times. According to Moeller et al. In 2023, there are genes that can enhance nutritional value by improving protein content and quality, fat, and glucan. Adaptation to new regions are found in genes controlling early maturation, accelerated growth, and drought resistance. A study by Rizet and Frey in 1988 found Avena sterilis to have traits that are regionally specific, such as high protein percentage in Libya and Iraq, high oil percentage in Israel, highest percentage of spikelets per panicle in the Middle East and Central Asia. This finding supports more in situ collection needed in these regions, with the possibility of traits for use in breeding. UK winter cultivars are dependent on traits from Avena byzantine, which comes from this area. Newer cultivar released by the US program in 2014, named Soil Saver, is from the black oat cultivar. It's adopted for use as a winter cover crop in USDA plant hardiness zones 8B through 10A in the south. And it's also used for forage and fodder. Hexaploid wild species of A. fatua and A. sterilis have been commonly used in US and Canadian breeding programs and resulted in commercial varieties, for example, Rapida, Sierra, Mesa, Montezuma, Marvelous, Dumont, Fiddler, Multiline E77 and Multiline E76, Webster, Starter, Pan 5, Centennial, and Ozark. Countries as stakeholders. Canada and the US have large collections and are actively looking to breed cultivars for larger kernel, yield, climate resistance, but have accession backlogs. Russia is economically important crop is oat. Japan actively studying phytoextraction of cadmium in agricultural soils using black oat. Germany, black oat for weed suppression in agricultural fields, as leaves have allelopathic properties. The industry as stakeholders. PepsiCo and subsidiary Quaker Foods North America have a large stake in oat industry innovation for economic growth. And also the equine industry values improved oat cultivars for quality horse feed and nutrition. Human health benefits. Oats are one of the major cereal crops that have human health benefits. Whole grain oats have a high lipid content, contain lysine-rich protein, soluble fiber like beta-glucan, and are a source of antioxidants and polyunsaturated fatty acids. High levels of linoleic acid and palmitic acid. Also a great source of B vitamins. Oats are associated with improved gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, and metabolic health. Oat milk and oat-based beverages sales currently on the increase yearly, while soy and almond industry have flattened. Food source for plant-based diets, vegans, lactose intolerant, and influences buying strategy of consumers concerned with climate change and meat production. It also helps in obesity because of positive satiety effect and lower blood cholesterol. Important products using Avena. The Avena species are increasingly important as a crop resource and food source worldwide. It's for a food source for humans, the advantages of dietary fiber, gluten-free, whole grain, milled flour, nutritious drinks, and coffee substitute. As a fodder source for animals, with the oat hulls used as fiber additive to animal feed for cattle and hogs, oats are important grain for horses. Agricultural use as cover crop to suppress weeds, green manure, poultry bedding, and as a biofuel pellet. Cosmetic industry, lotions, creams, moisturizers, black oat seed oil. Canada is the world's #1 oat producing country since 2022, just last year, which has just eclipsed Russia's production. Canada accounts for 85% of North American oat production. And on this last slide is a photo of the variety of oat products available that we have in our kitchen. We've got Bob's Red Mill Steel Cut Oats, Quaker Oats, Cheerios. I've got oat flour by Bob's Red Mill. We've got a company Planet Oat Milk and Bob's Red Mill Oat Bran.